this emerging public discourse became vulnerable to distorted information, to one-sided information, to stereotypes, to xenophobia, to all the phenomena that we see in public discourse and policy discourse on almost any topic. So in order to be able to have and to arrive at effective migration policy in our case, it was very important for us to start focusing also on this debate, because it was clear that no good policy could come out of a distorted public discourse. So to inject what we understand and what we know as fact-based, evidence-based discourse, we did our best to inject our side of the story into a larger discussion.
For public service media, it's of course crucial to give the right facts and figures and explain the background of migration, put news into context and debunk wrong information and counter disinformation, which is of course now a big problem in this context. This is very much what public service media do. But we find that audiences are often much less interested in abstract facts and figures. They rather want to have a human story and personal experience.
The key factor to be considered here is that disinformation and hostile actors exploit and amplify people's existing fears. So regardless of whether they are legitimate or not, these concerns are real, they are there. And in this context, we argue that communicators should acknowledge widely held concerns. Ignoring them, in our view, and this is an argument we make in the paper, would make it virtually impossible to reach out to those who are most exposed to disinformation and the fear-mongering articles that stoke anxieties that Paul described. So what we recommend in our study is that the communicators craft messages that resonate with public concerns.
This is how, and the reason why we in institutions need to work with journalists and to how we frame migration. We need to help them. This means that we need to understand what makes news, and we need to adhere and tell them to remember the principles of ethical journalism that they all have, and the codes of journalism that they all have in the newsroom. What does it mean in concrete? Well, it means that they have to report on facts, not on biases.
By impact, we don't mean sort of the number of Facebook likes or retweets or shares or whatever it might be. That's more outputs. We also don't mean the number of reports you've made or the number of campaigns you've done. These are all outputs. I'm talking about the actual impact you have on what the project's trying to do. If you're trying to dissuade people from migrating in an irregular fashion, then you need to show that your campaign has that effect.
So something that we've found very clearly in our research is that although there are certain narratives that are consistent across time, they are constantly being adapted to the news cycle. For example, whenever there is something in the headlines, that the disinformation actors can respond to that and adapt their stories appropriately.
Perhaps what is missing, and this is why we are cooperating more and more with the ICMPD, is just to have more voices on board from the other side of the Mediterranean. This is a unique opportunity to listen to not only the diaspora and watching the media, but also to make a common front, interact as much as possible with the public communicators from the other side.
We need to think about different dimensions and to recognize that in order to understand migrant narratives and narratives about migration, we need to take into account both domestic concerns and domestic priorities, as well as international priorities. There's also a need to take into account the history of migration. We often think about the migration crisis, between quotation marks, as a very, very much existing within the present, but we don't look at the historical roots that inform narratives about migrants and narratives about asylum seekers and refugees.
So how can we talk about the benefits of migration in a more effective way? The key here is to bring the community perspective into messages about migration. Going back to the COVID-19 example, this could mean showing newcomers and long-term residents working together, for example, side by side, to help their communities respond and recover from the pandemic. Messages that show communities, including migrants and refugees, working towards common goals can really help bring a sense of unity and social cohesion to our messaging. In other words, we want to focus on sharing unifying messages that emphasize the us rather than speaking exclusively about one group or another.
Involving people is essential to change the culture. Involving people in a way that they can be trained to identify this information and to not be fooled. Even with some small fact-checking methodology training, they can actually easily identify what pieces of information are actually not true. And they can also promote with their peers this idea of not sharing something that we don't know for sure that it's true. So I'd say those are the three main elements for involving the community in fact-checking initiatives.